Hello guys, July here again with another podcast episode. I know that I haven't uploaded one in quite a while. As you probably saw, my previous video was about my trilogy that I released a month ago, a digital trilogy, about pretty much everything that I discuss in my videos as well. So I will talk a little more about it at the end of this video, but definitely check out my previous video as well about the trilogy itself. And if you like it, consider getting yourself a copy, as that would help support me and this channel, and of course also the charities that I have involved in this project, but that is all discussed in that video. Okay, so then for this episode, so today's podcast is about why there could be only one Zezima, which is probably also going to be the title of this podcast. So I went back and forth between several options, such as why there will never be another Zezima, but then you might immediately say, well, that's because the high scores are saturated today, and that's very true, but that's not what I mean. So instead I mean two other things. So first, imagine if all high scores were reset and then everyone had to start over again. Today in 2021, you can safely assume that in this new race from 0 to max total level or max total XP, there will never be another Zezima. So then the second thing, even if we had a time machine and we could go back in time to Zezima's heyday, well, also then you could have safely predicted that there was never going to be a second Zezima, and that for reasons that are not related to the high scores. So those things are what this podcast is about, okay? So I'm not going to list all of Zezima's achievements here, that would be a long video. But for this video, it's important to know that Zezima became rank 1 in December of 2003 and then remained rank 1 until the release of the summoning skill in January of 2008. So that's 4 years and a month of being rank 1, losing it briefly only a couple of times after new skills were released, and then one other time when he let Nova Life pass him, also for only a couple of days. So that's all for the high scores that you need to remember for this video. 4 years of being rank 1, which is obviously a significant element in the story of the legendary status that he attained, but it is not the only factor, and that legendary status is really what this is all about if we want to answer the question in the title of this podcast. But to best understand, or to better understand why this is not necessarily about just the high scores, ask yourself two questions. Question 1, who is the most legendary player ever? Question 2, who is the best player ever? So almost everyone, without a doubt, would answer Zezima to question 1. But as for the best player ever, if we dig deeper into the history of player achievements, then at least some other people who followed big players back then or earlier or later would answer a different name. For example, other names that I often see in this discussion are Nova Life, Lilia V88, Zarfot, and Suwami. In fact, even I would argue that it is probably not Zezima. So the point is, you could have a very interesting discussion to figure out who the best player ever is, but when asking who the most legendary player ever is, the answer is pretty straightforward. There is just no other option other than Zezima. This proves that it is about more than just the high scores if we want to answer the question in the title of this podcast. So if not the high scores, or not just the high scores at least, then why else could there be only one Zezima? So that's what I'm going to explain in the next parts of this podcast. To begin with that, we need to go back to 2003, when RuneScape 2 didn't exist yet. And let's go back to December of 2003, because remember, that is when Zezima became rank 1 for the first time. So important here is the size of the community. Specific numbers don't exist, but the creators of RuneScape did occasionally include a relevant statistic in the official news posts, and that statistic is players online simultaneously, so at the same time, and then when a new record was broken. Fortunately, a news post from December of 2003, which is Zezima's first month as rank 1, did include that statistic, mentioning that for the first time ever, the game saw a total of 22k players online at the same time. Remember that value, 22k, because that's going to be important later on. I mean, I will repeat it again at that point, but it's always better to just remember things, you know. In the next 12 months after December of 2003, Jagex would share an update about the players online simultaneously statistic on 6 more occasions, the next one being 30k players online simultaneously for the first time, and that was in June of 2004. So that's from 22k to 30k in 5 months time. Try to remember this. Then the next update was given in August, showing 42.5k players online simultaneously for the first time. So that's from 22k to 30k to 42.5k. But from 22k to 30k took 5 months, whereas 30k to 42.5k took only 2 months. So that's 5 months for an increase of 8k players, followed by just 2 months for another increase of 12.5k players. So now I have a question. What major update happens in 2004? You know this one, come on. I will tell you, it was the launch of RuneScape 2 at the end of March, and that matters here, but not in the way in which you would think. So the obvious reasoning, which is the wrong reasoning, is RuneScape 2 was launched and boom, explosive growth of the community. But that is not entirely true. Why? Because this was still more than 2 months before the growth spiked from 30k to 42.5k players online at the same time, from June until August. So something must have happened in June or later, or in other words, more than 2 months after the launch of RuneScape 2 in March, that caused the size of the community to suddenly explode. And it can't have been the launch of RuneScape 2 because that happened 2 months earlier, so the timeline doesn't match. So what's that? What happened in either June, July, or August of 2004 that not only explains this sudden growth of the community, but that also explains why Zezima is the legend that he is today? If you are a veteran player from the RuneScape 1 era who did not quit playing at the time, then you just might remember. Okay, so pause the video if you want to think about it for a little. If not, then I will reveal the answer right now. So the answer to this mystery is Miniclip. So now you might have 2 questions. First, what's Miniclip? Second question, how does this have anything to do with Zezima? So the first question first. Miniclip is a website that still exists, by the way. It is a place that hosts various games and where other external games, so not from Miniclip, are advertised by the website owners as well. That was also the case in 2004 when Miniclip began advertising RuneScape as one of the top online games, which is or was a section displayed on the front page of the website. So it's a page that everyone would have seen at the time. As mentioned earlier, the spectacular growth of the RuneScape community began in June or later and then accelerated towards the figure of 42.5k players online simultaneously in August. What happened during those 2-3 months, from June until August, is that Miniclip began advertising RuneScape at exactly that point, which caused a massive growth of the community. In fact, at one point, Andrew Gower, who is one of the main creators of RuneScape, even considered disabling the account creation system because the influx of new players was just too much to handle. So it could be inferred from all this information that Miniclip played a crucial role in the development of the RuneScape community at the time, but not just then, also later on, because Miniclip continued advertising RuneScape for around 3 years in total. So add 3 years to the summer of 2004 and we're in the summer of 2007. Anyway, back to August of 2004. So the statistic at the time was 42.5k players online simultaneously for the first time. In the next months and years, as a result of Miniclip, this increased to 100k by January of 2005. So that's an increase of more than 50k players in just 4 months. So that's insane, but it gets crazier. So 100k in January of 2005. How many do you think by 2006? Take a guess. Well, there are no statistics for January of 2006, but by March, this number had climbed to 197k players online simultaneously. So let's say 200k. So from August of 2004 until March of 2006, this statistic increased from 42.5k to almost 200k. So that's a difference of more than 150k. And keep in mind, this is players online simultaneously, so the size of the community was a lot bigger than that. So how do all of these figures tie into the explanation of why Zezima is the legend that he became? I'll explain it now. Remember, Zezima was rank 1 from December of 2003 until January of 2008. All of Miniclip's advertising falls within that period, and that's the key, because it means that all of the spectacular growth of the community falls within this period as well. So let's do a little bit of mathematics now with those statistics from earlier. Well, you don't have these figures anymore, so I'll do it for you. Important to keep in mind here is players online simultaneously automatically means that we're talking about the active player base here. People who were actually playing RuneScape at the time, okay? So we're not looking at accounts that existed but weren't being used anymore. So, and if we look at people who were actually playing the game at the time, so the active player base, that's a statistic that quadrupled between the time Miniclip began advertising RuneScape and the final statistic from March of 2006. So if we play a little more with all those player online statistics, which you can do because you don't have them in front of you right now, but I do, then it turns out that by the end of 2004, or by January of 2005, whichever you want, more than 60% of the active community had started playing when Zezima was rank 1, which means that most players at that time looked at Zezima as the first rank 1 that they had ever seen in the high scores. By March of 2006, this increased from 60% to a whopping 89%. So in March of 2006, at least 89% of the active players had seen only one long-term rank 1, or one name that consistently appeared at the top of the high scores, and that name was Zezima. The ones who had seen other names as well are the people who had been playing since before Zezima became rank 1 in December of 2003. So that's also why I said at least 89%, because it's fair to assume that a number of RuneScape 1 players from 2003 or earlier quit playing RuneScape in the next years, and that while new players kept signing up to RuneScape during that period. So it's not a wild claim at all to say that over 90% of the community had by the end of 2007 known Zezima as the only long-term rank 1 that they had ever seen. So that's over 90% of the active players who probably couldn't even imagine seeing someone other than Zezima as rank 1, except of course very briefly whenever a new skill was released, but that never lasted for more than a few days. So, and that's the key factor in the story of Zezima's status as a legend. Since then, so since 2008, there have been other players who held rank 1 for a very long time, such as Gurjars, Suwami, Drumgun, and Lami, but I believe you pronounce it Lamai, so I heard. The latter of whom has held total rank 1 for a much longer time than Zezima by now, by the way. But we don't look at those players as legendary, or certainly not as legendary as Zezima. And the reason for that is because most of us were active players when Zezima was rank 1, so whenever someone says Gurjars or Suwami, we can say yes, but remember Zezima. 90% of the people couldn't say that in 2007. They saw Zezima as rank 1 and they couldn't say yes, but this or that other player, because there was no one else in their memory to compare Zezima with, and that is why Zezima is the legendary player that he is today. He gave us a memory that no one after him possibly could, just because we could always say yes, but remember Zezima. Due to Miniclip's advertising and the subsequent explosive growth of the community, Zezima did not have that kind of retrospective competition back in the first 4 years of the RuneScape 2 era. And keep in mind, even the RuneScape 1 players may not have, because in the months before, let's say the final half year, before Zezima became rank 1 for the first time, so then we're speaking the final half of 2003, there wasn't really one long-term rank 1. There was various players who kind of took rank 1 from each other. In fact, the only long-term rank 1 in the RuneScape 1 era was TKS, so that's spelled TKNS, pretty much like I said. And she held rank 1 from the summer of 2002 until the summer of 2003, so that's just 1 year. But it is a year, and it's the longest time someone had held total rank 1 in RuneScape 1. But it's only 1 year, so that's not even close to Zezima's 4 years, okay? So even RuneScape 1 players didn't really have that kind of comparison to make, okay? A final remark or asterisk to add to this 90% figure from earlier is that this 90% assumes that all accounts were legitimate players. Of course, we know that's not true, but I'll show you why that's not a problem and why that doesn't change anything, like not at all. So essential here is to kind of figure out how many accounts of the active player base were bots, right? So to my knowledge, Jagex has never released information about that, but there is one major event or one major update that we can use to make a sort of educated guess. What is that update? You know this, come on. So take 5 seconds to pause this video. So the update that I'm talking about happened in 2011. Rings a bell yet? No? Okay, so it was Bot Nuke Day in 2011, when Jagex rolled out new anti-bot software that instantly disabled 98% of all bots, but that's a story for another video. So following that update that killed 98% of all bots, the size of the active player base decreased immediately by 60%, so it's fairly reasonable to assume that all of those were bots. So now the question to ask is that 60% figure representative of the situation in early RuneScape 2? So unfortunately, we have nothing better to work with, so let's assume that by 2006, 60% of the active player base was indeed bots. If you remember that 90% figure from earlier, it won't actually decrease all that much even if you factor in that more than half the player base was bots. And let's prove that with more math. Again, I have the figures in front of me, you don't, so just listen. So if you take the 60% bots, if you deduct 60% from 200k players online simultaneously, remember that's March of 2006, then we end up with 80k legitimate players. Okay, so then take the original figure of 22k players online in December of 2003, when Zezima became rank 1 for the first time. Bots weren't as sophisticated yet back then, so the percentage was probably not 60%, so let's use 33% or 1/3. That's probably more realistic. So then 2/3 of the 22k players gives us around 15k legitimate players. Okay? Those 15k players are players who saw someone else other than Zezima as rank 1 when they began playing or when they were active at the time. More than 2 years later, we just calculated that there were 80k legitimate players in March of 2006. So that means that at most 15k players of those 80k players can have seen someone other than Zezima as long-term rank 1. So that means that even if we assume that 60% of all active accounts were bots in March of 2006, that decreases the original 90% figure only to around 75%. So that's still 3/4 of the active player base that saw only Zezima as long-term rank 1 by March of 2006. And keep in mind, the community only kept growing afterwards, so it would be reasonable to claim that by the end of Zezima's period as rank 1, which is January 2008, that more than 80% of the community had only seen Zezima as long-term rank 1. So long story short, the secret in this mystery of why only Zezima is such a legendary player today is the timing of his period as rank 1 compared with the timing of the period in which the community saw its explosive growth from 22k players online simultaneously to 200k players online simultaneously, and even more later on, because we stopped in March of 2006, but of course there's also the second half of 2006 and 2007, and the fact that there were a lot of bots doesn't actually change anything about that. In other words, it's not just his rank and his achievements, but also the growth of the community in 2004 and later that is responsible for the status as a legendary player that Zezima ended up receiving. So then you can start a little debate. So okay, so which was more important, the high scores or the growth of the community? So based on this video, you would argue the growth of the community, as its size basically increased by a factor of 10 during the first years of the RuneScape 2 era. But you could also say, yes, but without his achievements, he wouldn't have been rank 1, which is very true as well. So I guess the fairest conclusion is that both factors are equally important here, or that at least both factors are very important to a certain extent, and then you can still decide which you find more important. So I hope that you found this an interesting episode. By the way, these statistics that I mentioned, they are all included in a nice chart and discussed in my newly released ebook trilogy that I discussed at the beginning of this video, which has more than 1k pages. If you haven't seen it yet, check out my previous video, which is all about the trilogy and about where you can get yourself a copy for just $4.99. A part of each sale goes to charity, so you would not only support me, but also the charities if you decided to get yourself a copy, which I would very much appreciate. Okay, so that was all for today's video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and perhaps subscribe if you haven't yet. That would help this channel as well. So thank you for watching. I am July, and I hope that you will come back for more.